Now, the entire scene that you have just witnessed was shot entirely from an iPhone 6s. Now let me explain why this phone is still relevant in 2020, albeit being 5 years old. Now I understand that recent phones they have 3 lenses, 4 lenses, like internal stabilization with HDR10 plus and all of that pack feature. But needless to say, if you know what you're doing, you can actually still capture amazing image just using your iPhone 6s or any equivalent from that actually. So let's dive right into the editing process. First off, you want to make sure that you shoot at the correct resolution at 4K just because the iPhone 6s could afford to shoot at 4K. Plus, I'm entering for a competition for this video, so it only makes sense that I want to deliver the best of quality, hence I shot in 4K. And now down to frame rates. I shot at 30 frames per second so that I have 2 options. The first option is to when I don't want to slow down the clip, when I look at the clip and I think that it deserves the respect that it should, that it does not need any speed modification, so I just play it as a 24 frames per second timeline. However, should I notice if there is a small jitter in the video, or should I also notice that the video is just a little bit too short and I want to drag it out a little bit more, then that's when 30 frames per second you can convert to 80% speed on a 24 frames per second timeline. Now the next thing we're going to talk about is the movements of the camera. Always create depth in your image. Now I understand that the iPhone 6s, it's a really small sensor, much like the APS-C, that it cannot close down the aperture. So most often than not, we are only playing with a really not so shallow depth of field. We're playing with a really large depth of field. We can see everything and everything is perfectly in focus. So how do we make the image look more cinematic? Always induce in movements, plus try to glide up against something in the foreground. A wall, it can be a object, an iron bar, it can be pretty much anything that you think that it could be a really good foreground subject. And now to the best part about this whole tutorial, it's about colors. Editing colors is in fact one of the most crucial part, in fact one of the most best part in my honest opinion, to make the audience or to make your videos feel something, to have a feeling towards your image. Color science in the iPhone 6s is actually pretty great out of the camera. However, I'm noticing that the color red appears to be a little bit more of a bloodshot red rather than an actual red, as seen in this clip with the lantern on the side. Compare it to a 60 Mark II model, which I'm shooting right now, it produces a different kind of shade of red. Just a little bit heads up about how different devices handles color profiles differently. Now let's talk about saturation. So to make your clip stand out, you want to boost in more colors, and that's where the saturation tab comes in. So increase the saturation will only mean that your image is now becoming more rich of colors, making your audience feel like there is something magical about your image. But don't overdo it, like what I did here in my previous Colipe video, is because it is a telltale sign that you are just starting out as a videographer and as an editor, that you will pump in so much colors into your clip just to make it pop out. Now, here's a smarter way to do about it, right? You want to increase in specific colors, but you also want to mute in certain colors. Certain colors just don't appeal as much as to our human eyes, although it seems natural, but we just don't want it to be in our frame. For instance, the colors that I often don't like in my clips, and it's a personal choice of mine, it can be different from yours, is the color yellow. Let's look into this clip here. So we are at the War Museum clip here. Now you can see that the colors of the yellow under the Creative tab, you're going to head down to Curves, and you're going to see a hue versus sats, hue versus hue, and hue versus llama. Now you can see that I've done quite a bit of changes over here. And now let me show you the before and after before we talk more in details, right? So this is the before shot. Wow, looks great actually. Straight out from camera, iPhone 6s. Now iPhone series has been known for their amazing color science. However, hey, I've just noticed that there is a little bit of chromatic abbreviation over here. Interesting. There's a chromatic abbreviation over here. On the topic of the colors, right? So here we look at hue versus saturation and hue versus hue. Hue versus hue is ideally the thing that I play around first, and not hue versus saturation. That's just about the way I go around it. So hue versus hue, right? Now let me toggle back to the one that I have done changes to. So immediately you notice that the clip's a little bit more toned down rather than blasting in front of your eyes. I want the subject to be the Malaya border checkpoint and not onto the greens of the grass. As you can see, everything is in focus. Now I want to diverge the focus of the audience towards the subject. So how do you do that? Well, you can actually add vignette on the sides. That's one way around it. Or the second, let me show you vignette, right? You can actually click on vignette. you can actually add a little bit of vignetting, and that helps just a little bit. But however, in this clip I do not want to add any vignetting just because I prefer it without the vignetting. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna head over to the curves. So what I did is I essentially dip down the yellow on the hue, and that changes the overall image, and I dip down the saturation for the color yellow like this. Now we want to also talk about highlights and shadows. So let's look at this clip. Now this clip here seems pretty decent. The camera from the iPhone 6s does not have a feature such as HDR10. It does have HDR, but I believe that's only for photos. I might be wrong. So what I did is I exposed for the highlights first. Now here's a tip for you. Expose for the highlights so that you can recover whatever's in the shadow in post. That is because when you have a exposed shadows, it's truly difficult to recover information from the highlights, and that's something that I noticed over time. Now this is very true for everything digital. If you're shooting on a DSLR, mirrorless cameras, if you're shooting on a smartphone, often than not, highlights are the hardest aspect of information for the camera to capture. Shadows, no problem. You can actually raise them up in post. You can get back most of your information. So let's look at the before here. Wow, now there is a huge dip on the amount of light that's on the framing of the walls, and that's only because I expose for the background first. So when you expose for the background, it exposes for the highlight, right? So I expose for the highlights over here on the clouds and the skies, so that retains the information on the highlights. And because of the fact that it could recover the shadows more efficiently, I exposed for the highlights and I recovered the shadows in my basic correction tab, as you can see here on my shadows, and I lowered down on the contrast to make the image look like this. So I've already talked about hue versus saturation, I've already talked about hue versus hue. I haven't talked about hue versus lemma. Now let me explain why lemma is important specifically in this gate scene. To match the intensity of light that comes out from the background, which is our highlights, and to recover whatever that's lost in the shadows, you're gonna come across a lot of blackness over here that doesn't make any sense. So what we want to do is we want to head over to hue versus lemma and try to grasp the color of orange here. So the color orange sits about here, and what we're going to do is we're going to increase the color, and now you look at that, it's almost like magic where the prints on the side of the walls just jars right at you. Now that is example of how we grab attention and how colors and lemma can actually make your image look more cinematic. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the hue versus lemma. Now this is perhaps the best way that I can help improve on this image as I have known so far. However, you must also understand that there are limitations to how much that you can recover in post. If you're shooting on a really low bitrate camera such as the iPhone series or any other DSLR that just shoots an IPB codec, you might not be able to capture that much information back in post, producing a really weird artificial artifacts such as right here. So these are called artifacts. However, it is pretty okay with me to have a little bit of artifacts as compared to having an image that looks just before I done the editing, which is like this. So it's okay. Remember, it's okay to have noise, it's okay to have artifacts, but it's not okay to have an image just like this, right? You can actually do so much more to make your image look so cinematic. Okay, so I guess that wraps up our video for today on mobile cinematography iPhone 6s series. Do leave in the comment down section below what do you think on the next smartphone that I should be doing on mobile cinematography series. And I really do hope you support this channel by helping us by liking or subscribing to our work. And then in the future, we're going to be pumping out content from the Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra. That's pretty amazing, right? Alright, so thank you so much for tuning in again. My name is Rodric, and I'll catch you on the next series. Peace out.